I'm Hazel Mitchell, 27, and yesterday I became a millionaire when my Aunt Evelyn left me her entire estate. The attorney's words still echo in my head, $47 million in assets. 15 years ago, my parents dropped me at Aunt Evelyn's doorstep, promising to return in a week. They never did. Aunt Evelyn became my rock, my mentor, my real parent. Now she's gone, and I'm alone in her massive Westport mansion surrounded by wealth I never wanted, only wishing she was still here. The doorbell just rang. Through the peephole, I see two familiar faces I never thought I'd see again. My parents, wearing practiced smiles. Before I begin my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had family suddenly reappear when money enters the picture. Before the inheritance changed everything, my life was modest but meaningful. My apartment in New Haven was small, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and temperamental plumbing, but it was mine. The walls were lined with bookshelves, a librarian's occupational hazard. Working at Hartwick College's library wasn't glamorous, but I loved being surrounded by books all day. The salary barely covered my living expenses and student loan payments, but I managed. Every Sunday, I drove to Westport to have dinner with Aunt Evelyn. She lived alone in that beautiful colonial mansion overlooking the Sound, a property that had been in her family for generations. Unlike my biological parents, she never missed a birthday, graduation, or important moment in my life. When I was abandoned at 12, she became my guardian without hesitation. "Family doesn't abandon family," she would say, her voice firm with conviction. "Real love doesn't come with conditions, Hazel." She taught me everything I know about resilience. On nights when I cried for parents who didn't want me, she'd sit on the edge of my bed, her hand steady on my shoulder. "Your worth isn't determined by those who couldn't see it," she'd tell me. "It's determined by how you carry yourself through disappointment." Aunt Evelyn wasn't just wealthy in terms of money, she was rich in wisdom. She insisted I learn about investments, savings, and financial independence from a young age. "A woman must be able to stand on her own 2 feet, she'd say while reviewing investment reports with me. "No one else will catch you if you fall, remember that." My personality was shaped by abandonment. I became reserved, cautious about letting people in. My best friend Tara was one of the few who knew my full story. We met in college when we were assigned as roommates, and somehow her extroverted nature complemented my quieter one. "You build walls higher than the Great Wall of China," Tara would tease, "but they're not keeping me out." The call about Aunt Evelyn came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. I was shelving books in the reference section when my phone rang. The college president's secretary covered for me while I drove to Yale New Haven Hospital, but I was too late. A heart attack, sudden and unexpected at 68. She was gone before I could say goodbye. The funeral was small. Aunt Evelyn had outlived most of her friends, and our family, well, there wasn't much family to speak of. I sat alone in the front row of the chapel, clutching a handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. Several community members attended. Aunt Evelyn had been generous with local charities, but I was the only family present. 2 days after the funeral, I met with her attorney, Dylan Bailey, a distinguished man in his 50s who had handled the Mitchell family affairs for decades. His office overlooked the Westport harbor, tastefully decorated with nautical art and leather-bound law books. "Your aunt was very specific about her wishes, Hazel," he said, sliding a thick folder across his mahogany desk. "Everything goes to you. The Westport property, her vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard and Aspen, her investment portfolio, artwork, and liquid assets. The total estate is valued at approximately $47 million. I remember feeling like the room was spinning. "There must be some mistake," I stammered. "She never mentioned anything about this." "Evelyn was a private woman," Dylan replied with a gentle smile. "But she was absolutely clear about her intentions. She updated her will annually, and each time, you remained her sole beneficiary." The following days passed in a blur. I took leave from the library and temporarily moved into Aunt Evelyn's mansion to sort through her belongings. Each room held memories. Her study with the antique desk where she taught me to balance a checkbook, the sunroom where we shared Sunday morning tea, the kitchen where she insisted I learn to make her famous apple pie because some traditions shouldn't die. In her study, I discovered dozens of leather-bound journals documenting her life philosophy, business decisions, and thoughts about me. One entry from shortly after I came to live with her stood out. Hazel has a quiet strength that reminds me of myself at her age. She doesn't realize it yet, but being discarded by those who should have treasured her will forge her into someone extraordinary. My role is to ensure she emerges stronger, not bitter. Money can't buy character, but it can provide opportunity. One day, she'll have both. Reading her private thoughts, I felt a new dimension of grief. Aunt Evelyn hadn't just taken me in, she had seen something in me worth nurturing, worth investing in. And now I was alone with a fortune I never expected and the overwhelming task of living up to her faith in me. The doorbell echoed through the marble foyer of Aunt Evelyn's mansion, my mansion now, though I couldn't bring myself to think of it that way. Through the peephole, I saw them, Gerard and Monica Mitchell, my biological parents, standing on the doorstep as if they belonged there. My hand trembled on the doorknob. 15 years of absence condensed into a single moment of paralysis. I finally opened the door. "Hazel, sweetheart," my mother exclaimed, arms outstretched as if we'd seen each other yesterday. They had aged, of course. My father's dark hair was now salt and pepper, elegantly styled to mask the thinning. My mother had clearly had work done, her face was suspiciously smooth for a woman in her 50s. Both were expensively dressed, my father in a tailored Italian suit with a Rolex glinting on his wrist, my mother in designer clothes I recognized from fashion magazines. "We've been looking everywhere for you," my father said, stepping forward for a hug I couldn't bring myself to return. His cologne was overpowering, something costly and European. "For 15 years?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Their smiles faltered in perfect unison. "May we come in?" "It's a long story," my mother said, already glancing past me at the crystal chandelier in the foyer. I stepped aside, more out of shock than hospitality. They entered the mansion with appraising eyes, taking in the antique furniture and original artwork that now belonged to me. "We always knew Evelyn did well for herself, but this is something else," my father commented, running his hand along a marble side table. "How did you find me?" I asked, following them as they wandered into the living room uninvited. My mother settled onto the silk damask sofa, crossing her legs elegantly. "We never stopped looking, darling. When we saw Evelyn's obituary in the Times, we hoped you might be here." "Ah. So they've been monitoring obituaries, not searching for their daughter." "We should do dinner," my father announced. "Catch up properly. Is the kitchen stocked? I could make my famous risotto." Before I could answer, he was already heading toward the kitchen, as comfortable as if he owned the place. I followed in disbelief. 15 years without a word, and you want to make risotto?" My mother joined us, her heels clicking on the Italian marble floor. "Hazel, we know you must have questions. We had such difficult circumstances back then." Over dinner, which my father indeed prepared in Aunt Evelyn's kitchen using her premium ingredients, they spun their tale. Financial troubles had forced them to leave me temporarily with Aunt Evelyn, they claimed. They'd intended to return within months, but Evelyn had turned me against them and blocked their access. "She threatened legal action if we came near you," my father said, refilling his wine glass with Aunt Evelyn's expensive Bordeaux. "We were in no position to fight her money and influence. We wrote letters," my mother added, touching my hand across the table. "Did she never give them to you?" "No," I said quietly, though I didn't believe for a second that such letters existed. "We've been living in Europe," my father continued. "Trying to rebuild our lives so we could come back for you properly. Gerard Mitchell doesn't come back empty-handed, you know." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "We have a lovely little vineyard in Provence now. Nothing like all this, of course," she gestured around the kitchen with its professional-grade appliances, "but it's home." As they talked, memory surfaced, my father's explosive temper when bills arrived, my mother's chronic disappearances during difficult times, the constant moving whenever rent was due. And then the final abandonment. Just for a week, Hazelnut, my father had promised, using his pet name for me. Aunt Evelyn will spoil you rotten until we get back. A week became 2, then a month. No calls. No letters. Eventually, Aunt Evelyn hired a lawyer and became my legal guardian. By then, I had stopped asking when my parents would return. So, my father said, leaning back in his chair after dinner, the attorney must have met with you already. The shift in conversation was so abrupt it took me a moment to follow. About Evelyn's estate, he clarified, watching me carefully. Family should stick together in times like these. We want to help you manage everything. I'm sure it's overwhelming, my mother added, her eyes darting around the kitchen, mentally cataloging valuables. You're so young to handle such responsibility. I'm managing, I said, standing to clear the plates. We'd love to stay a few days, my mother said, following me to the sink. To reconnect. We have so much catching up to do. I froze, plates in hand. The thought of them staying in Aunt Evelyn's home, my home, made my stomach clench. But a small, wounded part of me, the 12-year-old girl who waited by the window for parents who never returned, whispered that maybe this was a chance for healing, for answers. The guest suite in the East Wing has its own bathroom, I heard myself saying. You can stay there. Temporarily. My father clapped his hands together. Wonderful. I'll bring in our bags. Bags. They had come prepared, expecting to stay. As they settled in like returning royalty, I retreated to Aunt Evelyn's study, the one room in the house I'd claimed as my sanctuary, and sank into her leather chair, wondering what she would advise me to do now. My parents settled into the mansion with disturbing ease, as if they'd been there all along. My mother claimed the master suite's dressing room as her little project, organizing Aunt Evelyn's designer clothes by color and season. My father spent hours in the wine cellar, emerging with recommendations for dinner pairings from the collection that was now technically mine. Their presence felt like an invasion, but I tried to silence my suspicions. What if I was being unfair? What if they really had tried to find me all these years? 3 days after their arrival, I met with Dylan Bailey again. His downtown Westport office felt like neutral territory, away from my parents' influence. Mr. Bailey, I began, once we were seated in his conference room, my parents have returned. They claim Aunt Evelyn kept them from me, threatened legal action if they tried to contact me. Is there any truth to that? The attorney's expression remained professional, but I detected a subtle tightening around his eyes. I think you should see these, he said, retrieving a file from a cabinet behind his desk. Evelyn kept meticulous records. The file contained dozens of letters, not from my parents to me, but from them to Aunt Evelyn, spanning several years after they left. I read them with growing horror. Evelyn, we need another loan. The Montenegro deal fell through, and creditors are calling. $50,000 should cover it until the new venture takes off. The girl is better off with you anyway. She was always more your type, bookish, serious. We're not cut out for the school meetings and teenage drama. Another $25,000 would help us get established in France. Our lawyer says we might have claim to Mitchell family assets through Hazel. Would be easier if you just sent the money directly. $100,000 this time. Consider it child support in reverse. Each letter was more mercenary than the last, with not a single inquiry about my well-being or request to speak with me. The final letter, dated just 3 years ago, contained a thinly veiled threat to contest any will that excluded them as Hazel's rightful parents. There's more, Dylan said gently, passing me another folder. Evelyn hired a private investigator to keep tabs on your parents after they left you. The PI's reports painted a damning picture. While claiming financial hardship, my parents had lived luxuriously throughout Europe, villas in Spain, ski chalets in Switzerland, gambling in Monaco. Multiple bankruptcies were followed by new schemes, always one step ahead of creditors. There were photos of them at galas, on yachts, living the high life while I believed they couldn't afford to keep me. Why didn't she tell me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to protect you from the truth, Dylan replied. She felt knowing they chose to leave would hurt you more than believing they had to leave. When I returned to the mansion, I found my best friend Tara waiting on the porch. I'd texted her an SOS earlier. Holy shit, she whispered when I let her in. The prodigal parents return the minute there's money. How convenient. Keep your voice down, I warned, leading her to the garden where we could talk privately. They're somewhere in the house. What do they want? Tara asked, though we both knew the answer. They say they want to reconnect, but they've spent every conversation trying to figure out what I inherited and how it's structured. And you're letting them stay here? Hazel, these people abandoned you. I know, I said, picking at a loose thread on my sweater. But what if there's more to the story? What if I owe it to myself to hear them out? Tara grabbed my hands. The only thing you owe yourself is protection from people who hurt you once and will absolutely hurt you again. That evening, I overheard my parents talking in the library. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but as I approached with tea, their urgent whispers made me pause outside the door. We need to move faster, my father was saying. The lawyer's probably poisoning her against us. I'm working on it, my mother replied. She's always been soft-hearted. I've been telling her how much I regret the past, how we were victims of circumstance. Another week, and she'll be eating out of my hand. We don't have another week. Jenkins wants his money by the end of the month, or he'll send people to collect. 2 million, Monica. We need to convince her to invest in something we control. What about the necklace? The diamond one in the safe? We could. Pocket change. We need access to the big money, the investment accounts, the real estate. Keep looking for the will. There has to be a loophole. I backed away silently, tea forgotten, my mind racing. In Aunt Evelyn's study, I began searching through her files more thoroughly than I had before. Behind a row of first edition books, I discovered a hidden wall safe I hadn't known existed. The combination, my birthday, revealed a stack of newspaper clippings about my parents, fraud allegations in Palm Beach, bankruptcy filings in Seattle, civil suits from former business partners. But most damning was a document dated just 2 weeks before they appeared at my door, a petition filed in probate court contesting Aunt Evelyn's will, claiming they were entitled to the estate as my legal parents. It had been filed and then quickly withdrawn when they realized a direct approach might work better. They had known about the inheritance before they ever rang my doorbell. They had never been looking for me, only for Aunt Evelyn's money. And now they were inside her house, going through her things, plotting to take what she had left to me. The 12-year-old girl who waited by the window finally stopped waiting. Hazel, darling, come meet your Uncle Perry, my mother called from the foyer the next morning. I descended the stairs to find a balding man in his 60s with the same calculating eyes as my father. I had never seen him before in my life. There's my favorite niece, he boomed, arms outstretched. Last time I saw you, you were knee-high to a grasshopper. We've never met, I stated flatly. An awkward pause followed before my father laughed too loudly. Kids forget everything. Perry and I were just reminiscing about the Mitchell family reunions at the lake house. You were so little then. The Mitchell Lake house was sold before I was born, I replied, recalling details from Aunt Evelyn's stories. And you're an only child, Dad. Uncle Perry turned out to be Perry Gladstone, my father's business partner in a series of failed ventures. He was the first but not the last family member to materialize in the following days. Suddenly, I had cousins I'd never heard of, great-aunts emerging from obscurity, all with conveniently tragic financial situations they hoped their dear Hazel might help with. My parents hosted an impromptu family reunion that weekend, inviting these strangers into Aunt Evelyn's home without asking me. I returned from a meeting with the estate's financial advisor to find caterers setting up by the pool and a bartender mixing cocktails in the kitchen. Surprise, my mother said, air-kissing my cheek. We thought you should reconnect with everyone. You've been so isolated. Throughout the evening, I was paraded before distant relatives and my parents' friends as our Hazel, who's had such a windfall. My father introduced me to investment advisors who slipped me business cards with winking assurances they could maximize returns. My mother casually mentioned to her friends that she was helping Hazel redecorate. The place is so stuffy and old-fashioned. When I objected to a group of strangers smoking cigars in Aunt Evelyn's greenhouse, my mother pulled me aside. "Darling, you're being terribly ungracious. After all we've been through to find you again, can't you at least pretend to be happy we're reunited?" "I didn't ask for a party," I said. "These people are strangers to me." "That's your aunt's influence," she sighed dramatically. "She always was jealous of my social connections. She turned you against us, made you cold and suspicious like her." It was my first encounter with my mother's particular brand of gaslighting, a skill she'd employ frequently in the coming days, making me question my own memories and feelings. Meanwhile, my father was systematically going through Aunt Evelyn's belongings, claiming items as family heirlooms that had unfairly gone to Evelyn. The Georgian silver tea service disappeared from the dining room. My grandmother's pearl earrings vanished from the jewelry box. When I confronted him, he expressed wounded surprise. These were Mitchell family pieces before Evelyn got her hands on them. "I'm just reclaiming our heritage for you, Hazelnut." But I noticed many of these heirlooms appeared in my mother's overnight bag, not displayed as family treasures. My parents worked as a team to isolate me from my support system. When Tara called, my mother would say I was resting or out with your father. They suggested my job at the library was beneath a woman of your position now and encouraged me to cut ties with my former life. Beatrice, Aunt Evelyn's housekeeper of 20 years who stayed on after her death, pulled me aside one afternoon while my parents were out. "Miss Hazel, I don't mean to overstep, but I heard them in the study last night. They were going through the financial papers, talking about something called establishing tenancy. And Mr. Mitchell was on the phone with someone about a real estate lawyer." I thanked her for the warning, my suspicions deepening. That night, I found my father in Aunt Evelyn's study, seated at her desk like he belonged there, speaking authoritatively on the phone with her financial advisor. "Yes, as Hazel's father, I'll be helping manage the transition. She's agreed to add me as a signatory on the accounts. Can we meet tomorrow to start that process?" I stepped into the room, making my presence known. He smoothly ended the call. "Just getting some things sorted for you, Hazelnut. No need for you to worry about all this complicated financial business." "I'm not adding you to any accounts," I said firmly. His face darkened momentarily before he forced a laugh. "Don't be silly. You can't handle this kind of wealth on your own. You're a librarian, for God's sake. I'm perfectly capable of managing my inheritance." "Your inheritance," he repeated, his voice taking on an edge I remembered from childhood. "You know, most daughters would be grateful for a father's guidance. Most daughters would want to help their parents after they've struggled for years." Struggled? I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped. "In villas across Europe? Gambling in Monaco? Well, I thought you couldn't afford to keep me?" His expression changed, calculation replacing faint hurt. "You've been talking to Evelyn's lawyer. That old buzzard always hated me. Whatever he's told you is twisted to make us look bad." Later that night, I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. I found my mother in Aunt Evelyn's bedroom, standing over the shattered remains of a Tiffany lamp that had been in the family for generations. "Oops," she said with exaggerated innocence. "It was so ugly anyway. We'll redecorate with something more modern." The next morning, I discovered my parents had invited a real estate appraiser to tour the house. When confronted, my father shrugged. "Just curious about the market. This place is awfully big for one person, don't you think? Selling it and splitting the proceeds would give us all a fresh start." That evening, they crossed the final line. Over dinner, they announced they had decided to move in permanently. "We've discussed it, and it makes the most sense," my mother declared, helping herself to more wine. "This house has plenty of room, and family should be together." "This isn't your house," I said quietly. My father's expression hardened. You've always been an ungrateful child. After all we've done for you. What exactly have you done for me? I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Besides abandon me for 15 years and come back only when there was money involved? We gave you life, my mother snapped. And this is how you repay us? By believing Evelyn's lies and treating us like criminals in our own family home? This was never your home, I said, standing up from the table. And neither of you are welcome to stay any longer. My father's face flushed with anger. You can't throw us out. We're your parents. We have rights. You gave up those rights 15 years ago, I replied, walking toward the door. I want you both gone by tomorrow morning. Or what? My father challenged, following me. You'll call the police on your own parents? Create a public scandal? The media would love that story, heartless heiress evicts struggling parents. His threat hung in the air between us. He knew, as I did, that public exposure was the last thing I wanted. But he had underestimated what 15 years with Aunt Evelyn had taught me about standing my ground. Tomorrow morning, I repeated, and left the room. The morning after my ultimatum, my parents made no move to leave. Instead, they acted as if our confrontation had never happened. My mother lounged by the pool while my father made calls from Aunt Evelyn's study. Their suitcases remained unpacked in the guest suite. They were calling my bluff. I needed a strategic response, not an emotional one. Aunt Evelyn's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, when facing adversaries, Hazel, never reveal your full hand at once. I drove to Dylan Bailey's office, taking back roads to ensure I wasn't followed. The attorney listened without interruption as I detailed everything that had happened. I'm not surprised, he said when I finished. Evelyn anticipated something like this might happen. She did? Dylan nodded, opening a drawer in his desk. She left specific instructions to be shared with you only if your parents reappeared after her death. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Aunt Evelyn's elegant script. Inside was a letter dated just 6 months earlier. My dearest Hazel. If you're reading this, I am gone, and Gerard and Monica have resurfaced like vultures circling an unexpected feast. I've always believed in preparing for all contingencies, and this is one I hoped would never materialize but knew was possible. First, know this, despite their legal status as your biological parents, they have no claim to your inheritance. The estate is structured through an irrevocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary. The trust includes provisions specifically designed to prevent them from accessing the assets through you. Second, I've instructed Dylan to connect you with Lawrence Kim, who has managed my security needs for years. The mansion has a sophisticated security system that includes recording capabilities in all common areas. Lawrence can activate these remotely. Third, and most importantly, do not underestimate their desperation or creativity in trying to manipulate you. I've watched you grow into a woman of remarkable strength and integrity, but they know which emotional buttons to push. Guard your heart as carefully as you guard your inheritance. Remember what I've always taught you, family is defined by love and loyalty, not by blood. You are a Mitchell in all the ways that matter. All my love. Evelyn. I read the letter twice, drawing strength from her words, before meeting with Lawrence Kim that afternoon. The security specialist was a former military intelligence officer who spoke with calm precision. The mansion's security system was upgraded last year, he explained, showing me controls I hadn't known existed. We can activate recording in all common areas, legally, since you own the property. The footage would be admissible in court if needed. Lawrence also recommended adding security personnel, discreet but effective, and showed me how to secure my personal devices and financial accounts with additional protection. Most importantly, he added, document everything. Keep a detailed log of all interactions, all missing items, all concerning statements. Evidence is your best defense. Armed with this advice, I contacted the financial advisor Lawrence recommended, who helped me secure the estate's assets more tightly. We changed access codes, required dual authentication for any significant transactions, and documented the current state of all accounts. While my parents believed I was running errands, I also reconnected with Aunt Evelyn's closest friends, people who had known my parents during their brief marriage and subsequent abandonment of me. Judith Winters, Evelyn's college roommate, provided particularly valuable insight. They were always chasing get-rich-quick schemes, she recalled over tea at her Westport home. Gerard had charm but no follow-through. Monica wanted status without work. Evelyn saw through them immediately but tried to support them for your sake. When they left you, she wasn't surprised, just heartbroken on your behalf. Judith and others from Aunt Evelyn's circle offered their support, creating a network I could rely on outside my parents' surveillance. Meanwhile, I played along with my parents' scheme, pretending to soften toward them. I listened to their stories about the hardships they'd faced, nodded at their suggestions about streamlining the estate assets, and appeared to consider their advice about firing Beatrice and other longtime staff who remained loyal to Aunt Evelyn's memory. My performance must have been convincing, because they grew increasingly bold. My mother borrowed Aunt Evelyn's diamond and sapphire necklace for a dinner party, claiming it had always been intended for the Mitchell women. When I calmly pointed out that the custom piece had been designed specifically for Aunt Evelyn's 50th birthday, my mother's mask slipped. "Your precious aunt took everything from me," she snapped. "My husband's family money, my position in society, and then my own daughter. The least I deserve is her jewelry." I documented the outburst and the missing necklace in my growing file of evidence. My father, meanwhile, grew frustrated with his inability to access the estate's investment accounts. I discovered him in Aunt Evelyn's study late one night, attempting to use her computer. "Just looking for those family photos we were talking about," he claimed, though the screen clearly showed he was searching through financial documents. "The family albums are in the library," I replied mildly. "But I've digitized most of Aunt Evelyn's photos. I could show you tomorrow." His forced smile didn't reach his eyes. "Always the organized one, aren't you?" The next evening, I hosted a dinner for my parents and deliberately mentioned that Aunt Evelyn had maintained homes in Martha's Vineyard in Aspen. "She took us to the Vineyard house every summer," I said, watching their reactions. "And the Aspen property has been featured in architectural magazines. We should visit them," my father said instantly. "Make sure they're being properly maintained." "Yes," my mother agreed too quickly. "We could start with the Vineyard house this weekend." "I was just there last month," I lied smoothly. "But the caretaker mentioned the Aspen house could use some attention. The mountain air is wonderful this time of year." The suggestion that they might soon have access to another valuable property visibly excited them. They didn't know I was laying groundwork for the next phase of my plan. The breaking point came when I overheard my parents on a call with someone they referred to as Dr. Nielsen, discussing psychological evaluations and competency concerns. "She's clearly suffering from grief-induced instability," my mother was saying. "Making irrational financial decisions. As her parents, we're deeply concerned about her mental state. The inheritance has overwhelmed her," my father added. "She's a librarian trying to manage a complex estate. Any reasonable judge would see the need for conservatorship. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent to control my inheritance." That night, I finalized my counteroffensive. I contacted Dylan, Lawrence, and the financial team Aunt Evelyn had put in place. The pieces were set. Now I just needed my parents to make their move. I arranged a formal dinner in the mansion's grand dining room, telling my parents I wanted to discuss the future of the estate with them and their financial advisor. They arrived dressed impeccably, my mother in a designer dress I recognized from Aunt Evelyn's closet, my father wearing cufflinks that had belonged to my grandfather. Their advisor, introduced as James Winston, was a slick man in his 40s with 2 white teeth and a fake British accent that slipped occasionally. A quick background check by Lawrence had revealed him as James Winslow, twice investigated for financial fraud in Florida. Beatrice served the meal with professional detachment, though I'd noticed her adding extra security cameras to the dining room earlier that day. The food was exquisite, Aunt Evelyn's favorite recipes, and the wine flowed freely. My parents grew increasingly animated as they outlined their vision for our family's future. James has exceptional investment opportunities that could double the estate within 5 years, my father announced, clapping the fraud artist on the shoulder. Minimum buy-in is just $5 million, Winston/Winslow added with a practiced smile. But for family, we could start with 3. We've also been thinking about the properties, my mother interjected. This house is lovely but outdated. Selling it could free up capital for more lucrative investments. And the artwork, my father continued. Insurance costs alone eat up returns. We should liquidate most of it. I nodded thoughtfully, watching them build momentum, waiting for the right moment. Before we go further, I said during a pause, I have some questions about your plans for me. They exchanged glances. For you, darling? My mother asked cautiously. Yes. For instance, which mental facility were you planning to commit me to after having me declared incompetent? The one in Connecticut or the one in New York? The room went silent. My father recovered first, forcing a confused laugh. What are you talking about? I reached for my phone and pressed play on the recording of their conversation with Dr. Nielsen, their voices filling the dining room. She's clearly suffering from grief-induced instability. As her parents, we're deeply concerned about her mental state. The inheritance has overwhelmed her. Any reasonable judge would see the need for conservatorship. My mother's face drained of color. My father's jaw tightened. You've been recording us? That's illegal, he blustered. Not in Connecticut, not in my home, and not when there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, I replied calmly. Which there certainly is. I pressed another button on my phone. The dining room doors opened to admit Dylan Bailey and 2 police officers. These are just a few of the recordings I've collected, I continued, laying my phone on the table. I also have documentation of items you've taken from the house, fraudulent claims you've made to financial institutions, and evidence of your attempted impersonation of me on multiple accounts. This is ridiculous, my father exploded, standing so violently his chair toppled backward. We're her parents. We have every right. You have no rights here, I interrupted. Not legally, not morally, not after abandoning me 15 years ago. I turned to Dylan, who placed a thick folder on the table. These are the letters you've sent Aunt Evelyn over the years, I said, opening the folder. Not asking about me, not trying to reconnect with your daughter, but demanding money and threatening legal action when she refused. My mother's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she reached for the letters. These are forgeries, she whispered, but her eyes told a different story. And these, I continued, placing another stack of documents on the table, are reports from the private investigator Aunt Evelyn hired to track your activities after you left. Detailed accounts of your luxurious lifestyle while claiming poverty. Evidence of multiple frauds and bankruptcies. Names of people you've scammed who would be very interested to know your current location. You wouldn't, my father said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register I remembered from childhood. We're family. Family? I repeated, looking directly at him. Family doesn't abandon a 12-year-old girl with promises to return in a week. Family doesn't stay away for 15 years and reappear only when there's an inheritance. Family doesn't plot to have someone declared mentally incompetent to steal their money. I stood, feeling stronger than I ever had in their presence. Aunt Evelyn was my family. She taught me about love, integrity, and standing up for myself. The only thing you two taught me was what family shouldn't be. The door opened again, admitting Lawrence Kim with a legal document. This is a formal cease and desist order, Dylan explained, sliding it across the table. It prohibits you from making any claims against Hazel or the estate, from contacting her in any way, and from remaining on any property owned by her. You can't do this, my mother said, tears welling in her eyes, tears I recognized as strategic rather than genuine. We're your parents. We gave you life. And then you gave me up, I replied evenly. You made your choice 15 years ago. I'm making mine now. Uncle Perry, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly stood. I should mention that I'm willing to testify about your plans to contest the will and have Hazel committed. In exchange for immunity, of course. My parents stared at him in shock. Another betrayal, but this time not directed at me. You were never going to include me in the payoff anyway, Gerard, Perry said with a shrug. Just like Miami in '09 and Vegas in '15. The security team Aunt Evelyn had put in place escorted my parents and their advisor from the property. As they walked to their car, my father turned back. This isn't over, Hazel, he called, his face contorted with rage. We'll contest the will. We'll drag you through court for years. You'll spend more defending the inheritance than it's worth. His threat hung in the air as they drove away. When the gates closed behind them, I sank onto the mansion's front steps, trembling with adrenaline and relief. Years of abandonment, weeks of manipulation, hours of confrontation, it all crashed over me at once. Dylan sat beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. Your aunt would be incredibly proud of you, Hazel. I nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in my throat. For the first time since Aunt Evelyn died, I allowed myself to really cry, for the loss of her, for the parents I never truly had, and for the 12-year-old girl who had waited so long for them to return, only to discover they were never worth waiting for. The days following my parents' departure were strangely quiet. The mansion, always spacious, now felt properly mine for the first time. I wandered its rooms, reacquainting myself with Aunt Evelyn's treasures, our treasures, without the shadow of my parents' greed hanging over each object. Yet despite the physical distance, their presence lingered like a bad smell. My father's parting threat echoed in my thoughts, we'll drag you through court for years. I knew them well enough now to recognize it wasn't an empty threat. They would return, perhaps not physically, but through lawyers and courtrooms and possibly the media. On Dylan's recommendation, I began seeing Dr. Lillian Carter, a therapist specializing in family trauma. Our first session was held in Aunt Evelyn's sunroom, neutral territory that felt safer than inviting a stranger into my more personal spaces. Abandonment at such a formative age creates deep wounds, Dr. Carter explained during our initial meeting. The recent events have likely reopened those wounds while creating new ones. I thought I'd processed their abandonment years ago, I admitted. Aunt Evelyn helped me work through it. But seeing them again, realizing they came back only for the money, it's like being 12 again, wondering what was wrong with me that made them leave. Nothing was wrong with you, Dr. Carter said firmly. Their actions reflect their character, not your worth. It was a sentiment Aunt Evelyn had expressed countless times, but somehow hearing it from a professional gave it new weight. Over the following weeks, our sessions helped me untangle the complex emotions their reappearance had triggered. I realized I had been carrying a silent hope that they had changed, that they might actually want to be my parents again. Acknowledging the death of that hope was both painful and liberating. Meanwhile, Dylan and his legal team prepared for the inevitable legal challenges. We documented everything. The current state of all assets, the security footage of my parents' behavior in the house, their recorded conversations plotting against me. The good news, Dylan reported during a strategy meeting, is that your parents have a significant legal disadvantage. Their abandonment is well documented. Their subsequent actions show clear intent to manipulate and defraud. And Evelyn's estate planning was meticulous, she built in specific provisions to prevent exactly this scenario. True to form, my parents filed their first legal challenge 3 weeks after leaving the mansion. They claimed Aunt Evelyn had alienated their daughter's affections and manipulated a vulnerable minor into turning against them. They demanded compensatory damages for emotional distress and challenged the validity of her will. It's a fishing expedition, Dylan assured me after reviewing their filing. They're hoping for a settlement to make them go away. We're not settling, I said firmly, channeling Aunt Evelyn's resolve. I was hoping you'd say that, he replied with a smile. As predicted, my parents also approached several media outlets with their distorted version of events, loving parents cruelly separated from their daughter by a manipulative wealthy relative, now being denied access to their child and their rightful inheritance. Fortunately, their history of fraudulent behavior made most legitimate news organizations wary of their claims. One tabloid did run a sympathetic piece featuring my mother's crocodile tears, but it gained little traction. Dylan arranged for a simple statement to be released in response. Ms. Mitchell regrets her estranged parents' decision to publicize a private family matter and remains focused on honoring her late aunt's legacy through responsible stewardship of the estate. Throughout this period, I continued exploring Aunt Evelyn's study, discovering layers of her life I hadn't known about. Behind a hidden panel in her bookcase, I found another cache of personal journals dating back decades. Reading them gave me new insight into the remarkable woman who had raised me. One entry from shortly after my parents left particularly resonated. Gerard and Monica have abandoned Hazel with me, claiming temporary financial hardship. Their pattern suggests they won't return, certainly not soon. I should be angry, and part of me is, but mostly I feel a strange sense of purpose. This child deserves so much more than the parents' fate gave her. Perhaps this is my opportunity to ensure at least one Mitchell grows up with proper values. Not the hollow pursuit of wealth that consumed my brother, but the understanding that true worth lies in integrity, kindness, and resilience. Through her journals, I learned that Aunt Evelyn had been involved with dozens of charities and causes, many focused on supporting abandoned and foster children. Her philanthropy had been quiet but substantial. Inspired by her example, I began connecting with these organizations, learning about their work and how I might continue her support. Tara, who had been my rock throughout the ordeal, helped me design a security system for the new life I was building. We created a small, trusted circle of advisors and friends, people who had known and respected Aunt Evelyn and who demonstrated loyalty not to her wealth but to her values. "You know what's crazy?" Tara said one evening as we sorted through Aunt Evelyn's art collection, cataloging each piece. "Your parents thought the inheritance was just about money and stuff. They completely missed that the real inheritance was everything Evelyn taught you, her wisdom, her values, her strength." She was right. The material wealth was substantial, but Aunt Evelyn's true legacy was in the person she had helped me become, someone who could face down her greatest childhood fear and emerge stronger. Gradually, I began transforming the mansion, making it truly mine while honoring Aunt Evelyn's presence. I converted one wing into a private library that would eventually be open to scholars and researchers. I refreshed rooms that felt oppressive without erasing their history. I replaced the bed in the master suite where my mother had slept, exorcising her brief occupation. The legal proceedings dragged on, but each of my parents' claims was systematically dismantled. Their history of abandonment, the documented attempts to manipulate and defraud me, and their prior bankruptcies and financial schemes severely undermined their credibility. The judge assigned to the case seemed increasingly impatient with their shifting allegations. 6 months after they had appeared on my doorstep, I received news that transformed everything once again. My parents had been arrested in Florida for an investment scheme remarkably similar to what they had attempted with me. This time, however, they had targeted an elderly retiree with early-stage dementia, and his family had pressed charges. The Florida charges, combined with evidence from our case, create a pattern of elder abuse and fraud, Dylan explained when he delivered the news. "They're facing significant jail time. Will this affect our case?" I asked. "It essentially ends it," he replied. "Their attorneys have indicated they're willing to drop all claims against the estate in exchange for us not providing additional evidence to the Florida prosecutors. Do we agree to that?" Dylan smiled. "That's entirely your decision, Hazel. What would Aunt Evelyn do?" I knew the answer immediately. She would ensure justice was served, but not pursue vengeance for its own sake. "I believe that's right," he agreed. I decided to neither help nor hinder the Florida prosecution. My parents had created their own fate, just as they had 15 years ago when they drove away from Aunt Evelyn's house, leaving their daughter behind. With the legal challenges resolved, I could finally focus completely on the future. I established the Evelyn Mitchell Foundation for Children in Transition, dedicated to supporting young people who had experienced family disruption through abandonment, foster care, or loss. Looking at myself in Aunt Evelyn's mirror one evening, I realized I was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. The girl who had been abandoned was now a woman standing firmly on her own feet, precisely as Aunt Evelyn had intended. 6 months after my parents' arrest, the mansion had transformed along with me. Gone were the heavy drapes and somber colors that had marked my parents' brief occupation. The rooms now balanced Aunt Evelyn's classic taste with touches of my own personality. Colorful throw pillows in the formal living room, modern art alongside traditional pieces, bookshelves in nearly every room. I had settled into a new routine, dividing my time between managing the estate, developing the foundation, and pursuing my own interests. I'd taken a leave of absence from the library but found I missed the work, eventually accepting a position on the board of the New Haven Public Library System instead. On a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a year after Aunt Evelyn's death, Dylan Bailey called with a request to meet urgently. His tone gave nothing away, but something in his voice suggested importance. He arrived carrying a slender package wrapped in archival paper and sealed with wax, Aunt Evelyn's personal seal I recognized from her important correspondence. "This was in our firm's secure vault," Dylan explained, setting it on the study desk. "Evelyn left explicit instructions that it be delivered to you 1 year after her death, regardless of circumstances." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter in Aunt Evelyn's distinctive handwriting, along with a small USB drive and what appeared to be an old photograph turned face down. "I'll give you privacy," Dylan said, stepping toward the door. "No," I replied quickly. "Please stay. Whatever this is, I might need support." He nodded and took a seat across from me as I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Hazel," it began, the familiar greeting bringing a lump to my throat. "If you're reading this, a year has passed since my departure. I had hoped to share this truth with you in person, but fate may have decided otherwise. What I'm about to tell you may shock you, perhaps even anger you, but please read to the end before forming judgments. You are not my niece, Hazel. You are my daughter. In the spring of 1994, I discovered I was pregnant at age 40. The father was a man I loved deeply but could not marry due to complicated circumstances. Unmarried pregnancy still carried stigma, especially in our social circles, and my position at the foundation would have been compromised. After much soul-searching, I approached Monica, who had recently married my brother Gerard. They were struggling financially, as always, and eagerly accepted my proposal. I would provide generous financial support if they would raise you as their own. The arrangement worked for 3 years, during which I remained close as your aunt, watching you grow from a distance that broke my heart daily. When you were 3, I discovered Gerard had been embezzling from the foundation where I worked. To protect him from prosecution, I resigned from my position and used personal funds to repay what he had stolen. This was the first major breach in our arrangement. For the next 9 years, I continued supporting them financially while maintaining my role as your doting aunt. Their lifestyle grew increasingly lavish while their parenting became more negligent. I considered revealing the truth and seeking custody many times, but feared the trauma such a revelation might cause you. When they abandoned you at 12, claiming temporary financial hardship, I recognized it as the blessing it truly was. I became your guardian legally while remaining your aunt in your understanding. I couldn't bring myself to tell you the truth then, to reveal that the parents who had abandoned you weren't your parents at all, and that I had essentially given you away at birth only to reclaim you later. I feared such knowledge would be another trauma on top of abandonment. Every day since, I have questioned my decision to keep this secret. Perhaps it was selfishness. Perhaps it was misguided protection. I hope someday you can forgive me for both the initial arrangement and the years of silence that followed. The USB drive contains DNA test results confirming our relationship, along with original birth records and the legal agreement with Gerard and Monica. The photograph is the only one taken of us together on the day of your birth, before you were given to them. You have every right to be angry with me. I gave you away, then reclaimed you only after they discarded you. But please know that from the moment you were born, you were loved completely. Every decision, however flawed, was made out of love. Whatever you feel upon reading this, know that I am deeply proud of the woman you have become. You are everything I hoped for in a daughter, strong, compassionate, principled, and resilient beyond measure. With all the love in my heart. Your mother, Evelyn. My hand shook as I turned over the photograph. There was Aunt Evelyn, no, my mother, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. Me. Her eyes gazed at the infant with such naked love that I couldn't speak. Did you know? I finally asked Dylan, my voice barely audible. He shook his head. Evelyn never shared this with me. The package was sealed when she entrusted it to our firm. I inserted the USB drive into the computer. True to her word, it contained DNA test results confirming Evelyn Mitchell as my biological mother, original birth records listing her name before amendments, and a scanned legal agreement signed by Gerard, Monica, and Evelyn, outlining financial support in exchange for raising me as their child. Most shocking was a series of bank statements showing monthly payments to my parents for 12 years, payments that increased regularly and eventually totaled over $2 million. They hadn't abandoned me because of financial hardship. They had been paid handsomely to raise me, took the money, and then abandoned me anyway when a more appealing lifestyle beckoned. I need some time, I told Dylan, who nodded understandingly and left me alone with the revelation that had turned my understanding of my life upside down. In the following days, I cycled through every emotion imaginable. Anger at Evelyn for giving me away, for not telling me the truth sooner. Betrayal that my entire understanding of my origins was false. Confusion about who I really was if not the person I had believed myself to be. But gradually, other emotions emerged. Understanding of the impossible choices a single pregnant woman in her 40s might have faced in the mid-1990s. Gratitude that she had remained present in my life, had taken me in when the arrangement failed, had loved me completely even if from a self-imposed distance. And finally, a profound sense of belonging I had never fully experienced before. I wasn't a child who had been abandoned by her parents. I was a child who had been loved so much by her mother that she had sacrificed her own happiness to give me what she thought would be a better life, then stepped in to raise me herself when that arrangement failed. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, I visited the small private cemetery where Evelyn was buried. I brought fresh flowers and the photograph of us on the day of my birth. "Hello, Mother," I said aloud for the first time, the word feeling strange yet right on my tongue. As I stood there, I realized that the inheritance Evelyn had left me wasn't the money or the properties or the art collection. It wasn't even just her values and wisdom, as Tara had suggested. The true inheritance was the knowledge that I had always been deeply wanted and loved, not by the people I had called parents, but by the remarkable woman I had called aunt. A month later, I received a letter from the women's correctional facility where my mother, Monica, was serving her sentence for fraud. Unlike my father, who maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, she had accepted a plea deal. "I know nothing I can say will erase the pain I've caused," she wrote. "But I need you to know the truth, now that Evelyn is gone. She was your real mother. We took money to raise you as our own, then abandoned you when it became inconvenient. Of all the shameful things I've done in my life, that remains my greatest regret. I don't ask for forgiveness, only that you know that the failure was entirely ours, never yours." I read the letter several times, uncertain how to feel about this final confession. It offered no new information after Evelyn's revelation, but it did provide something unexpected: closure. The woman who had pretended to be my mother had finally told me the truth, allowing me to fully embrace the woman who actually was. The Evelyn Mitchell Foundation for Children in Transition took on new meaning as I redirected its focus to include support for unconventional families, single parents, grandparents raising grandchildren, aunts and uncles becoming guardians. Evelyn's story, our story, would help others navigate complex family situations with greater support than she had received. In her garden, surrounded by the roses she had tenderly cultivated, I often found myself studying old photographs, now seeing the resemblance I had missed before: the same eyes, the same determined set to our jaws, the same smile. DNA had made us mother and daughter, but love had made us family, even when separated by silence and secrets. The final page of Evelyn's last journal contained a quote from her favorite poet, love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. Her love had never altered, even when our relationship had been forced to alter by circumstance and convention. And in the end, that unalterable love had given me the greatest inheritance of all, the knowledge that I had always belonged exactly where I ended up, with her. What would you do if you discovered a life-changing family secret after losing someone you loved? Would you prefer to know difficult truths or live with comforting illusions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that family is defined by love, not just by blood or legal ties. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey, and remember that sometimes our greatest inheritance isn't what's in the will, it's the love that survives long after someone is gone.